both because of his treatment of women, and he does deserve some criticism for that, I think, though it was a different period when he lived, and the age of consent was incredibly young, pretty much all over the world. Um, but then the other thing is, he's attacked as being a Westerner, expropriating other cultures, which is also there's some validity to that, but one has to remember that he wasn't just a Western European. He was partly Peruvian. He claimed, why am I? Just a second. He claimed to have Inca blood. One never knows with Gauguin, though, because he makes up so much stuff. This is a self-portrait that he did 2 or 3 years after he had started becoming a Sunday painter. He was 25 at this point, and he'd just been doing Sunday paintings for 2 or 3 years. But let's go back a little. His life history, I think, sheds a lot of light on who he was and the work he did. He is, in fact, the first modernist Latino artist, because he's part Peruvian, and well, let's go first his background a little bit more before we go into that. His grandmother, Flora Tristan, is very famous. She wrote a book, actually, which he carried around with him for the rest of his life. He worshipped his grandmother. She was an intellectual, women's liberationist at a very early period. And also, she was one of the people who established the foundation for the 1848 revolutions that swept Europe. And she actually died before the revolutions opened. As you can see, she died in 1844, but she was considered a very important political figure, and he deeply admired her for that. His mother, her daughter, was married to a journalist in Orléans in France. This journalist was very left-wing, and after the failure of, or at least not the total failure, but large, pretty much failure of the 1848 revolutions, he was a hunted man. So he and his wife, this is Gauguin's interpretation of his mother, long after her death, by the way, from a photograph, and clearly painted in the South Seas, in the South Sea style. He was remembering her. He was very close to his mother. So his mother and father, he and his sister, who was 2.5 years older than him, headed for Peru because they were related to the royal family there, and they were seeking shelter. And they were taken in. At this point, he was about 16, 18 months old. They were taken in. They lived for the next 6 years in a palace where he was waited on hand and foot. And he also shared a bed with them some of the time with a mulatto girl, and his mother collected Peruvian art, indigenous Peruvian art, especially pottery. And he would have seen all this as a child. When they left, there was a revolution when he was 7.5, and the family fled Peru. Well, the mother and kids fled Peru, went back to France. She now had no means of support, so she became a dressmaker in Paris. And Gauguin was farmed out at the age of 7.5 to his grandfather in Orléans, where he was put in a boarding school, which must have been quite a break, quite a change for him. He had to learn French. He would have been bullied. Um, after he graduates, he becomes a merchant marine. He gets a license as a navigator. And then after serving, I think, 2 years in the merchant marine, he serves 2 years in the French Navy, 2 or 3 years, at which point he's 23 and a relative gains him an entrance into the French stock market and he becomes a stockbroker. He's very, very successful as a stockbroker, partly because he goes into the profession as the market is rising. And he earns a huge amount of money. He marries a Danish woman who lives in France, who is a French teacher. Over the period they're together, which is about 10 years, they have 5 children. Immediately, he's married and established a household. He starts becoming a Sunday painter. He has no experience, but you saw that portrait done 2 years after he started, and he has no training. You can see the guy is incredibly talented.
What is a Sunday painter?
Sunday painter is someone who just paints on the weekends. It's a pejorative term, and it really, actually, I shouldn't use the term because, a painter is a painter, but it's a term that's used for people who just do it part-time. He lives in the 8th arrondissement, quite near where the Impressionists hang out at the cafes. He gets to know them. He's the kind of person he was incredibly intelligent and very personable, charming. And he met people very easily. He also used people. So he gets in with the Impressionists. At first, they invite him. Well, he starts collecting them in a big way. So they appreciate him and they invite him because he's interested in painting to paint with them. And of course, he paints with Pissarro. And this is during the period when he was painting a lot with Pissarro, that he painted this picture. And this picture, if you're going to paint with Pissarro, you're going to paint the snow, right? But they're both they're very competent paintings. He paints this. It's a servant, one of their servants, according to his son. Notice the mandolin here. He was a musician as well, and also an extremely good writer who published in his lifetime. This was actually very much one of the only works of his. This was appreciated by the Salon and well reviewed, actually. And it's highly competent painting. This is a painting he did of his family. At this point, there are 4 kids. So, well, no, 3 kids. This probably is his wife, yes, Met. So there are 3 kids with 2 more to come. After a while, he moves. Initially, he's living in a very fancy place. Later, they move to much, much cheaper location. But what happens is in 1882, the market collapses. And he has savings, fortunately. And he decides at that point to devote himself to painting and moves his family to Rouen because he thinks there are possibilities there. He doesn't succeed. Their family is going broke. They move back. He and his wife and children move back to Denmark to be with her family. He sets up as a tarp salesman, tarp being used for sails and other. It has many uses, of course, in those days in the shipping industry, but the Danes don't want French tarps. So he doesn't succeed at all. And meanwhile, the tension between him and his wife is developing, getting quite serious. He goes back to Paris to paint full time and takes his 6-year-old son Clovis with him. And here he is in a garret in Paris, looking pretty desperate. It's a very different painting from his early self-portrait. He and his son nearly starved because he couldn't raise any money, and he did odd jobs, menial jobs on the street. His son got very sick, and finally his sister came to his aid and took over his son, who eventually was returned to the family in Denmark. Meanwhile, he heads for Pont-Aven in Brittany. There's an artist colony there, very, very cheap to live in Brittany in those days. And he also is attracted by Brittany was very primitive compared to the rest of France and very, very traditional at the time. And he's totally taken with the local dress, the local people, the peasant, the still surviving peasant society. And you can see that he's learned something from Pissarro here. You remember Pissarro was doing all these traditional paintings of field hands and people in the countryside. He becomes very quickly the leading painter among the painters in Pont-Aven, partly because he's very worldly, tough guy. He's a street fighter, probably from his years in the Navy, and very talented and has brilliant ideas. So he becomes the leader of what will become known as the Pont-Aven school. One of his friends in the Pont-Aven school is Laval, who we see here admiring one of Gauguin's still lifes, which show at this point an incredible amount of Cézanne's influence. And this is why Cézanne got very angry and said that Gauguin had stolen his small sensation. Gauguin had the ability to charm everyone and end up having almost everyone hating him. So he and Laval decide they're going to go to the Caribbean, and they head for Panama and discover that Panama has been totally ruined by the French project to build a canal there. Because he has no money, Gauguin works for a couple of weeks on the canal. Then they go to Martinique, which is where this is painted. They rent a tiny little leaky hut, and they paint and they paint. And he does actually some very interesting paintings. And you can see he's really at home in the tropical environment. He's very comfortable here. This is one that I've always loved, and I originally thought it was a painting of Tahiti, but it's Martinique. You can see that there's hints of where he's going to go when he goes to Tahiti, what he's going to do with painting when he goes to Tahiti already in these paintings. Well, eventually they both run out of money, and in those days, and it was true with the British too, if you ran out of money in a foreign country, the French government and the British government would bring you home for free. So they avail themselves of that, and he does this several times in his life. So this is a swineherd in Brittany. And he's back with the Pont-Aven group, and he's now, his style is changing, and a new movement is being created, which is, well, we'll see in a minute. There's another painter. Okay, Gauguin is in touch with Van Gogh, and Van Gogh and his brother see the Martinique paintings and are extremely impressed by them. And Gauguin writes to a friend of his, Emile Bernard, who is he's a very young painter. He's 20 years old at the time, but a good friend of Van Gogh's. He says, Gauguin is back from Martinique. He's in Pont-Aven, you should see him. So Emile Bernard, who has no money, walks with his 17-year-old sister, it's about 500 kilometers, from Paris to Pont-Aven, and joins Gauguin there, and proceeds to help develop a new style. I don't think this is a great painting, but he's doing something new. He's creating areas of flat color, basically flat color with dark outlines. And he calls it cloisonnism, like cloisonné, you know, cloisonné, the enamel, which has these little metallic borders between the different colors of the enamel. You've probably seen that, right? Does that ring a bell to people? Anyway, so it's called cloisonism, and Gauguin immediately adopts it in a much more subtle and refined style. If you look at these figures, they have black outlines, though it's much subtler. So what is this painting about? This is what Gauguin has been moving towards. And at this point, he's basically rejected Impressionism. He's seeking, he feels that Impressionism is too much the surface of things. He wants to get at something deeper that will move the core of the emotional core of people. And he also thinks that linking it with religious traditions gives it more power. He doesn't just link it with Christianity. In fact, he's highly critical of the Catholic Church, but he will eventually become almost a I'm trying to think of the religion that where they accept all the religions. Unitarianism. He's almost a kind of an early Unitarian in the way he will just absorb religions and cultures. But this, what he's imagining here is the parishioners coming out of church with their priest and imagining what they'd heard about in the sermon, Jacob wrestling the angel. And this was very well received by the Pontavon school. And he offered it to one of the local stone churches, and the priest refused, much to his annoyance. He offered to just give it to the church, but the church didn't like, the priest didn't like it very much. So as I said, they were both of them, Bernard and Gauguin, were in contact with Van Gogh, and Van Gogh wrote and said, well, why don't you both paint each other and we'll exchange portraits? Well, that's not exactly what happened, because Gauguin was much more interested in painting himself than painting Emile Bernard. So he painted himself, but he put Emile Bernard in the corner. And he titles it Les Miserables, because he was beginning to feel, and I think he always felt this, he knew he was a genius. And I think he was right to think he was a genius. He was. And he was feeling put upon by society that made it so hard for him to realize his genius. And he writes to Van Gogh about this portrait, which he sent to him. I feel the need to explain what I was trying to do, not that you're not capable of guessing by yourself, but because I don't believe I've achieved it in my work. The mask of a thief, badly dressed and powerful, like Jean Valjean, who was the hero of Les Miserables, who has his nobility and inner gentleness. The rutting blood floods the face, and tones of fiery smithy, which surround the eyes, suggest the red-hot lava that sets our painters' souls ablaze. The drawing of the eyes and nose, like flowers in Persian carpets, epitomizes an abstract and symbolic art. That girlish little background with its childish flowers is there to testify to our artistic virginity. And that Jean Valjean, whom society oppresses, outlawed with his love, his strength, isn't he too the image of an impressionist today? By doing him with my features, you have my individual image, as well as a portrait of us all, poor victims of society taking our revenge on it by doing good. That's pure Gauguin. And Emile Bernard also does a portrait, which he sends to Van Gogh, and does the same thing. Puts a quite a good little caricature of Gauguin in there. Um, and meanwhile, down in Arles, because remember, mail in those days went very fast between places. In England, we had 5 mail deliverers a day when I was a little child. It was the principal way of communicating. So probably within a few days, these paintings traveled, and the letters. Van Gogh painted this picture for Gauguin in response. So meanwhile, Van Gogh and Theo are working on Gauguin to join Van Gogh in Arles. And Theo sugars the pill with offering, well, there'll be enough money. I'll add a little extra money and the two of you can share and can live in the yellow house together. And, you know, Gauguin would have a way of continuing to paint. So Gauguin eventually jumps at the opportunity and joins Van Gogh in Arles. And one of Van Gogh's ideas was that they collaborate on each other's paintings or share ideas. And so Gauguin does this where he takes, Van Gogh had already painted the Night Cafe. Gauguin adapts a portion of the Night Cafe, modifying it a little, and then puts another portrait that Van Gogh had painted into it in the foreground. So there's a real collaboration going on here. He also paints this portrait of Van Gogh. Van Gogh's response when he saw it was, "You've painted me like a madman," which was to become all too true, unfortunately. The sunflowers, he paints him painting the sunflowers, partly probably because Van Gogh, in preparation for Gauguin, had painted a whole series of sunflowers and decorated Gauguin's room with sunflowers, paintings. They both paint, actually early on, they both paint in the Allechamps, which is this road leading out of Arles, which has, on both sides, has tombs. Originally, they were Roman tombs, and later they were, but it kept being used as a burial site into the period when they were painting, actually. So they both painted here. I'll show you next time. We'll go into this more when we cover Van Gogh. Well, of course, as you know, and I'm just going to close this door. I'll be right back. But as you know, the story of their collaboration ends very badly. According to Gauguin, and we only have his account, really, Van Gogh came after him with a razor, probably because Gauguin had won the affections of Van Gogh's favorite prostitute, but we don't know. And then Gauguin cuts off, well, Van Gogh cuts off his ear, et cetera, and Gauguin leaves immediately. He just flees the whole scene. Back in Paris, well, I actually don't know where this is painted, but this is in pretty much in this sequence. He paints this portrait of a ham, which I think is an incredibly unusual still life, and very, very, very eye-catching. It is most authorities believe it was influenced by this painting by Manet, which was in Degas' collection. And Degas and Gauguin had a really strong relationship that never broke down, one of the few for Gauguin. And Degas was actually a great supporter of Gauguin. He helped him out on a number of occasions. So Gauguin returns at this point to Brittany, to the Pont-Aven, and he now gets into. It's interesting that he starts to see himself as Christ. This is a self-portrait as Christ. It's a very powerful image, though. And he's now Christ in the Garden of Olives, about to be betrayed meditating on the fact that he will be crucified. Again, a very, very clear self-portrait here. He always exaggerated his nose slightly to give himself more Inca features. Here he's between Christ and the devil. See, he's meditating now on good and evil, and God knows what this has to do with. It might have something to do with his whole blow up with Van Gogh, though they continued to correspond throughout the rest of Van Gogh's life. Here he is again, the angel, and this is meant to be a serpent here, and the apple here, of course. A painting that I've never liked very much, but it shows something about his state of mind. And now he does now this is interesting. He wanted this blood coming out of the mouth and from down here. There are no ears. So some people have suggested this was a reference to what Van Gogh did to himself. But it's also derivative of pottery that, now this isn't something his mother collected, but she might have collected it. This is Peruvian ceramics, pre-Columbian ceramics. And these heads with an opening at the top are really quite common in the culture. And I think he's interested in using it as a vase because this was fired in an incredibly hot furnace, and then these beautiful, delicate flowers come out of it. It's kind of image. It's a symbol of what a painter has to go through to produce great art, in his opinion. This is an homage to Cézanne, and kind of a little bit of a step backwards in his work, actually. He's imitating Cézanne's style again here. This in the back is it was his most prized painting in his art collection, which over the years he would disperse to finance his artistic activities. It was the last thing he gave up, though. But okay, around the time of this portrait, well, actually a little before it, there's an exposition in France, a national exposition in which Tahiti is featured as one of their colonial possessions. And he's utterly smitten by it. And as much as he had sailed all around the world, he'd never been to Tahiti. But he was taken in by the presentation of the exposition, and he decided he would go and live with the natives in Tahiti. So he actually, well, let me see, I'm just looking here. Well, he raised money, and and he got money he got some help from Degas, and he set out for Tahiti. And this was actually his first portrait one of his first portraits of a native woman that he painted there. One of the things he discovered was that the culture had been completely corrupted, that in any areas where there was any European influence, which was most of the island, the women were constrained to wear these dresses with that covered them up to the neck, whereas they had before gone around, in almost a state of nakedness. But the depiction of her face is just, I think, superb. So having discovered, well, Papeete is way too, the capital is way too expensive for him. He moves into a village along the coast and 45 miles away from Papeete into a hut. And he proceeds to paint the natives. And of course they're less controlled by the government and the church out here, but still what he's painting is not really what he's seeing. He starts to reconstruct the culture. He's been given a book on their culture and their original religious beliefs, and he absorbs this, but he also superimposes Christianity on it. In this case, it's called Ave Maria in English. He immediately starts using the native language. He was extremely good with languages. It's a stunning painting. Look at the angel here. Now, at this point, he takes what's called a vahine, a young Tahitian woman, as his partner. She's, I think she's 13. The age of consent was like 12. And she actually will bear him a child before he leaves. The story is not the same as the story you saw in the film. And proceeds to paint some really magnificent pictures, which you've got to realize are they're what I think is going on with Gauguin, and I think it's worth saying at this point, is Gauguin had an almost, I think, schizophrenic personality, in that he was raised in one culture, one totally different culture under incredible conditions until the age of 7.5. And then he's thrown into another culture, which he absorbs and becomes very competent at, and marries and has a family. But when he starts painting, the other Cézanne, the other Gauguin, the Gauguin of his childhood, begins to manifest itself. And that's what I think is going on with him. He does some wonderful sculptures. He does a huge amount of wood carving. He also does, we'll see it later, wood block printing. And back in France, when he returns for a while, a lot of ceramics. But this is a gorgeous piece of sculpture, I think, wood sculpture. Women on a Beach, which clearly to me was painted inside. And then he put this to make it seem like they were on a beach. But I'm pretty sure that this woman is his vahine here. This is a very famous, the title of this is When Will You Marry? And this actually set a record, at this point, the third most expensive painting ever auctioned in the world. And I've always loved this painting. I think it's very powerful. And the faces are a little shocking the way he's treated them, because they're both natural and masks at the same time. Something that would later impress Picasso. And this I know is Tahura, and she is here, is called the seed of Aoi, and she's represented here as the goddess Veramat, wife of Oro, god of war, and the founders of a secret warrior society. Also another quite enchanting painting. This painting, the story he tells of this painting, you see how look of fright here? He claims that and we don't know with him what's true and what's not, because he's always making stuff up. But he also has incredible adventures. He was out at night. He comes back to the hut, which is dark. So he strikes a match, and which wakes her in terror, because the natives still believe that at night you were in the presence of death, which was watching over you. and she thought death had arrived. This is his image of death there. Around this time, there's an auction, there's a sale of his work in Copenhagen, organized by his wife, that's very successful. And he's also run out of money in Tahiti. So he prepares to return with 70 paintings. This is called The Beautiful Land, I think, if I'm, see, where are we? Where are we? Yes, Delightful Land. But this figure, even though it has his Fahin's head on it, is actually based on a Javanese sculpture. He lifts from everywhere, from every culture, and combines them in this paradise that he's created, which has a little tiny bit of connection to Tahiti, but not that much. This is also a strange painting because he witnesses the funeral of King Pomare, who's an indigenous king, though at this point he doesn't have much power under the French. He wasn't beheaded though, but he puts him as if he's been beheaded here, because in France, shortly before the voyage to Tahiti, he'd witnessed a guillotining. It's not really clear why he does it. He calls it the royal end, and these are supposed to be the mourners here. So he's kind of, he's creating stories all the time with his painting, which have some connection to reality, but are also products of his own active imagination. This is a painting I've always liked. It's called The Sun and the Moon and the Earth. This is Hina, the moon, and this is Fato, the earth. And in this painting, it is from one of their myths. She is begging Fatou to give eternal life to humans, which he refuses to do. When he gets back to France, he has a show arranged by Degas, and who also buys several paintings. And so he actually gives Degas this painting in gratitude. Now he's back in France, but this time he comes back and presents himself as this artist who's gone to this very exotic place, and he presents himself in a very exotic manner with a cane with an ivory handle. And he also he does some incredible sculptures. This is his biggest sculpture, which wasn't actually seen until I think 1907 at an enormous exhibition of his work, and particularly affected Picasso. It's the first time that anyone in the West had done a sculpture of a figure in a primitivist manner like this. He also takes on as a partner or girlfriend this young Javanese woman who has a pet monkey, and the two of them parade around, he in exotic costumes and her in her own exotic costumes, making a kind of sensation in Paris. And then he goes with her to Pont-Aven to join his friends there for a while. Unfortunately, in Pont-Aven, some sailors start picking on Anna the Javanese, as she was known, because of her and her monkey. And he steps in, and he's a street fighter and a good boxer, but in the fist fight with several sailors, actually, he gets his leg caught between some cobblestones and trips and breaks his ankle. And maybe because he doesn't have any money, it's not set properly. Takes several months for him to recover. And while he's recovering, Anna the Javanese goes back to Paris, and she knows where he's hiding, and apparently has a key to his flat, knows where his money is hidden. He has a considerable amount of money hidden there, and she goes off with it and disappears. Here he is. During this period, he would also hold salons, and he was a very good musician. So he's playing the piano here. So because Degas, in 1895, he decides he's going to return to Tahiti. They have another show of his work. Degas again purchases a number of paintings because his paintings weren't selling that well. And he leaves for Tahiti. He leaves for Tahiti under a cloud. At this point, most of the art community in Paris dislikes him for being a showman, dislikes him for having pestered a number of them for money, dislikes them for his argumentative nature, the fact that he's betrayed, according to the Impressionists, he's betrayed Impressionism. They're totally furious with him. And actually, Emile Bernard, the young man who walked all the way to Pont-Aven to meet him, publishes an article attacking him in the Parisian newspaper. So he arrives back in Tahiti, and he now has enough money. He sets up for a while in Papeete, in the capital of Tahiti. And for about a year, he's socializing and he's writing. He writes for papers. He becomes an editor of one paper. He opens his own newspaper. And he's kind of a figure in the community for about a year until he gets tired of that and moves down the coast and builds himself a house. He also is doing, and he starts doing a lot of woodcuts. And this one's interesting because look, he's combining indigenous religious symbolism with Christ. Because for him, there was no different, all the religions basically taught the same thing at their core. And he thought they should all be seen as equal. He disliked, he was a lot of Christianity interested him, the original Christian story, but he had an intense dislike of the Catholic Church. Of course, he has another Vahin who's seen here, who will bear him 2 children. And he's running out of money again, and he's in despair. He paints this huge painting, which he sees as his last great masterpiece. It's about, well, I'll read you what he says about this painting. Because he wrote letters to everyone. It is a canvas, 4 meters 50 in width by 1 meter 70 in height. The 2 upper corners are chrome yellow with an inscription on the left and my name on the right, like a fresco. And he was a great admirer of frescoes, by the way. He'd seen the Italian frescoes. Like a fresco whose corners are spoiled with age and which is appliqued upon a golden wall. To the right at the lower end, a sleeping child and 3 crouching women. 2 figures dressed in purple confide their thoughts to one another. An enormous crouching figure, out of all proportion and intentionally so, raises its arms and stares in astonishment upon these 2 who dare to think of their destiny. A figure at the center is picking fruit. Probably a symbol of the tree of knowledge. 2 cats near a child, a white goat, an idol, its arms mysteriously raised in a sort of rhythm, seems to indicate the beyond. Then lastly, an old woman nearing death appears to accept everything, to resign herself to her thoughts. She completes the story. At her feet, a strange white bird holding a lizard in its claws represents the futility of words. So I finished a philosophical work on the theme comparable to that of the gospel. Not a modest man. Well, he claimed that after this, he went out into the woods and tried to poison himself, but he overdosed and survived. We don't know if that story is true, but he was definitely desperate at this point. He was in a lot of pain. He was in pain for the rest of his life from his broken ankle that was never set. He also was developing sores on his legs and had a weakness of the heart, which he didn't make the connection, but the modern doctors think for certain he was suffering the effects of syphilis. So he was in a desperate state, but he then gets word from Vollard, who had also picked up Cézanne, that he's willing to give him a monthly stipend and buy a certain number of paintings from him every year, which and sends him some money. At which point, Gauguin decides it's time to leave Tahiti and head for the Marquesas Islands, which are much more remote and undeveloped, and they're 850 miles northeast, mostly north, but a little bit east. And curiously, are on the same latitude as Peru. This is before he left Tahiti, actually. And this is probably I think this is the last of his Tahiti paintings. Oh, actually, no, I'm sorry. We're now, maternity, I'm not sure of the date, but I'm pretty sure this is actually in the Marquesas. He doesn't do a lot of great work in the Marquesas. He's already in terrible shape. But this is one of his finer works. And oops, wait a minute, go back. Sorry about that. He also continues to do not just wood blocks, but he's also he's doing. When I'm presenting, sometimes I just forget words. It's very annoying. Anyway, he's doing these kind of prints, which it's called a nightmare, by the way. He's doing an enormous amount of works on paper. This is very interesting, though. Some years before sometime before he requested sunflower seeds, and he plants sunflowers, and he does a series of sunflower paintings. And clearly, he's remembering Van Gogh and the room that was covered in sunflower paintings in Arles. He's remembering Europe because this is a little copy of a Puvis de Chauvin painting that he carried with him. He carried a huge amount of mementos from Europe and images of paintings and photographs of paintings and sculpture, which he would adapt to his own works quite regularly. He ends up doing 4 sunflower paintings. This is my favorite of them. This is a painting, and a very fine painting, I think. This is the daughter of, no, this is the wife of a chieftain in the mountains, a red-headed woman, as you can see, striking. well, but I should, and her name is Tohu Tao. So he's there, he arrives there in Marquesas. At this point, he's painting there, so it's a while later. But when he arrives, he goes to some effort to befriend the bishop, because the bishop is really the most powerful guy there. And attends services and gets to be very close with him, to the point where the bishop agrees to sell him a piece of land in the town, actually, though the town is it's a very small town. It's more like a village, and the houses are quite far apart. And Gauguin builds himself, with the help of a couple of locals, builds himself a really solid and quite beautiful house in the traditional manner, but much more solid than they usually built, which is lucky because a typhoon comes through and takes down most of the rest of the town, but his house is still standing. He then proceeds to wine and dine all the local natives in these big parties. And the main there's two levels to this house. The upper level, which will become his studio, where he feasts everyone. He has the walls covered with his collection of erotic photographs, which absolutely, totally outrages the bishop. But but Gauguin gets his revenge because he knows that the bishop has a mistress. And I'll get into that in a minute. But here again is the same woman, the wife of the chief in the mountains, with another Tahitian. And this strange figure here is actually a kind of demonized portrait of someone he knew, a painter he knew in Pont-Aven. Maya Han was the man's name. And here he represents the corrupting influence of European culture on native cultures. That's the kind of the point of this painting. This painting is called The Sorcerer, but a lot of people have suggested the way he's painted, he's actually a third gender person, which existed among the Tahitians, still existed then to some extent. Well, Marquesans at this point, still existed to some extent in the hinterlands. The population, which had been 80,000 before the French arrived, had diminished to 4,000 natives because of disease. So Gauguin, who's very literate and very smart, discovers that the church is making the native people, all the children, attend their schools. And he discovers that the law actually only provides for children of families within 2.5 miles of the church. And he informs the natives, who withdraw a huge number of children. And then Gauguin takes up with one of these children, who I think is 14. She becomes his vahine there in the Marquesas for a while. She will eventually become pregnant and leave him to go back to her native village, and he never sees her again. On the front of his house, he puts this sign, which means house of pleasure, because he believed, and this is something that makes him very modern, actually. He believed that the source of health for all human beings was pleasure, and that men and women should both enjoy pleasure. The bishop is not pleased by this. He's even less pleased by this, because this is a caricature of the bishop. It's a huge wooden sculpture. It's a caricature of the bishop as a devil. And Van Gogh sets it up on one side of the entrance to his house. And on the other side of the entrance of his house, he sets up a likeness of the bishop's mistress, another sculpture. he also, and he's kind of sick and suffering right now, and he gets into a number of rows, and one of I can't even go into them all. There are so many. He's writing, because he was a writer in Tahiti. They'll still publish his articles in Tahiti. He's attacking the administration, the Marquesas, for all kinds of things. He also ends up accusing the chief gendarme of the island of corruption, which he can't prove. So he loses a libel suit, and he's sentenced to 4 months in jail and 500 francs fine. He's about to, and then he appeals, and he prepares to return to Tahiti to defend himself in court in Tahiti. But he dies. And the original explanation that I'd always read was heart attack, but the current opinion is that it was morphine, overdose of morphine. He was suffering great pain, both from his sores and his ankle. So it may have been a mistake, or he may have done it on purpose. We have literally no way of knowing. But before that moment, because I jumped a little ahead of myself here, he also writes a book. It's a philosophical text, which has been published, the modern spirit and Catholicism, in which he castigates the Catholic Church for its dishonesty. And these are two of his last, they may not be his last paintings, but they're late in his time in the Marquesas. And they're not as strong as his other work, but they're quite charming. And to me, there's he's very close to Degas, and he loved Degas' paintings, his horse paintings. I think he's thinking about Europe, he's thinking about Degas. Around this time, before he died, he was thinking of returning to Europe for treatment, because there wasn't a trained doctor on the island. But he was, a friend wrote to him saying, "You are at the moment that extraordinary, legendary artist who sends from the depths of Oceania his disconcerting, inimitable works, the definitive works of a great man who has disappeared, as it were, off the face of the earth." And Daniel de Montfrid, who wrote this, it counsels him to stay away a while longer because his star is rising. Which is probably why Gauguin delayed his return. He, a couple of other things he said that I think are worth quoting. One thing about his kind of philosophy, he said, "No one is good, no one is evil. Everyone is both, in the same way and in different ways. It is so small a thing, the life of a man, and yet there is time to do great things, fragments of a common task." That was in his journals the last year of his life. And to other artists in his Pontevin period, he said, a hint: don't paint too much direct from nature. Art is an abstraction. Draw it out from nature while dreaming upon it, and concentrate more on the creative process than on the result. That is the only way to come close to God, namely doing the same as our divine master, creating. And there is no such thing as exaggeration in art, he wrote in 1885. And I even believe that there is a salvation only in the extremes. So I think I may have the date wrong, but I believe it's in 1907, it's 1906 or 1907. There's a big exhibition of his work. Picasso is already aware of his work because he's read Noah Noah and he's seen some of his work in as early as 1903. But he and Matisse are both blown away by a huge show of Gauguin's work in 1907. And it actually, Gauguin has a profound influence on the future of Western art, both for his introduction of the decorative, his breaking away from the realism, but also for his absorbing and making part of his work primitive art. And it's the first time that any Western artist would do this. And Picasso in particular is aware of his adoption of many of the primitive in quotes, by the way, I should put it in quotes, his absorption of many of the, and use of many of the primitive traditions to give strength and power to his work. And actually Picasso interprets this as a magical power, which he'll harness, the magical power of, particularly of, in his case, African sculpture. So he kind of opens, Gauguin more than anyone opens a Pandora's box. And that's about all I have to say. I would be really delighted to hear your responses. I think